You've probably heard of it, right? This secret number for beauty, a kind of mathematical code, roughly 1.618, that's supposedly everywhere. We're told it's in the pyramids, the Mona Lisa, even in our own faces. It's called the golden ratio, and it's basically sold as a universal formula for what looks good.
And it's a really cool idea, isn't it? The thought that beauty isn't just some random preference, but that it's actually hardwired into the math of the universe. That's the whole promise of the golden ratio, or phi, as it's sometimes called.
It's a great story. But what if the real story, the facts, are even more interesting? A story about us, about human psychology, our absolute love of finding patterns, and, well, our tendency to see meaning even where there might not be any. Okay, let's dive into this and see if we can separate the math from the myth.
So, our investigation has to start with the name itself. I mean, if the ancient Greeks and Egyptians were really using this golden ratio and everything, you'd think they would have called it something, right? Well, let's take a look at the timeline.
This timeline really tells you everything you need to know. Back around 300 BC, the mathematician Euclid just called it the extreme and mean ratio. Yeah, not very catchy. It took all the way until 1509 for it to get the fancier title, the divine proportion. But look at this, the name we all know, the golden section, doesn't even show up until 1835. So this whole idea that ancient civilizations were obsessed with a golden anything, it's just impossible. They couldn't have been. The name didn't even exist yet.
All right, let's move on to the first big piece of evidence people always bring up. The claim that the Great Pyramid of Giza, one of the wonders of the ancient world, was built using the golden ratio. This is like the cornerstone of the whole myth.
The claim is super specific. Proponents say that if you take the slant height of the pyramid and you divide it by half of its base, you get a number that's incredibly close to phi. And you know, when you look at it visually like this, it seems to fit perfectly.
And when you actually run the numbers using the accepted measurements, you get about 1.62. Now that's only 0.1% off from the real value of phi. Seems like a slam dunk, right? Case closed? Well, not so fast.
The mathematician Martin Gardner pointed out the huge problem with this kind of thinking. With something as complex as a pyramid, you've got dozens of possible measurements to pick from: height, slant height, edge length, base, half base. As Gardner's quote says, if you just juggle those numbers long enough, you're bound to find a pattern that looks important. It's basically the mathematical equivalent of seeing animals in the clouds.
This way of thinking actually has a name. It's called the pyramidology fallacy. You start with the answer you want, like the Egyptians used the golden ratio, and then you just hunt for the data that fits your theory. And crucially, there are absolutely no ancient Egyptian texts that ever mention this ratio. Plus, other, much simpler mathematical ideas also fit the pyramid's dimensions. The golden ratio is just one coincidence you can find if you're really determined to look for it.
Okay, so from Egypt, let's head over to Greece and talk about the Parthenon in Athens. This is probably the most famous, the poster child for the golden ratio in all of architecture. I guarantee you have seen this image before, or one just like it. A perfect golden rectangle is just slapped right on top of the Parthenon's facade, and wow, everything seems to line up so beautifully. It really looks like open and shut proof that the ancient Greeks used this ratio to achieve perfection.
But when you actually start looking closer, the whole thing just falls apart. First off, the Parthenon is a ruin. Getting precise original measurements is incredibly hard, and different experts have totally different numbers. Second, just like with the Egyptians, there are 0 ancient Greek texts that mention using this ratio for building design. Third, that neat little rectangle, it often conveniently leaves out the triangular roof or other bits of the building that, well, don't fit. And maybe the most damning fact of all, one very credible measurement of the facade gives a ratio of 1.71. That's not even close to 1.618.
So, the ancient architecture claims are pretty shaky. But what about the great masters of the Renaissance? Surely Leonardo da Vinci, the ultimate artist/scientist, used the golden ratio in his masterpieces, right?
And here we go again with those familiar diagrams. You see these overlays of golden rectangles and spirals placed on top of Da Vinci's art, like his unfinished painting Saint Jerome, to try and show how he supposedly composed the image. It's always presented as proof of his mathematical genius.
But this brilliantly illustrates the whole problem. These overlays are completely arbitrary. I mean, if you really look at the St. Jerome example, the rectangle is just floating there. It doesn't actually line up with the top of his head or his body in any meaningful way. But here's the real smoking gun. We know for a fact that Da Vinci illustrated a book on the divine proportion. The catch? He did that around 1496. He painted St. Jerome way back in 1483,
a full 13 years before he ever worked on that book. It's just not possible.
Okay, so the historical evidence for architecture and art is really weak. But what about the central claim? The whole idea that the golden rectangle is just the most beautiful, aesthetically pleasing shape to the human eye. Well, that's something we can actually test. Let's try a quick experiment right now. You and me. Take a look at this next slide. Don't overthink it, just go with your gut. Pick the one rectangle that you find the most appealing.
So, which one did you choose? Was it obvious? Was there one clear winner that just felt, right? This is a lot like the psychological experiments that researchers have been running since way back in the 1860s. They show people a bunch of different rectangles and just ask them to pick their favorite.
And the results have been consistent for over 150 years. There is no clear preference. None. While yeah, some people might pick the golden rectangle, just as many pick other ones. Overall, any preference for it is super weak and statistically insignificant. So our supposed innate love for this perfect shape turns out it's just another part of the myth.
So, if the evidence from history, architecture, art, and even psychology is so flimsy, why is this myth so powerful? Why do we want to believe in this secret code for beauty so badly?
Well, it's because it follows this very seductive pattern, almost like a recipe. First, you start with something real. The ratio 1.618, it absolutely exists. It has some really cool mathematical properties. Then you connect it to things we already admire, like the Parthenon or a Da Vinci painting. You have to allow for a little wiggle room, a fudge factor in the measurements. Then you just conveniently ignore any data that contradicts your theory. And what you're left with is a story that feels profound and true, like you found a hidden order in a chaotic world.
As George Markovsky, the author of the research we've been walking through, puts it, the claims made about the aesthetic importance of the golden ratio, they just seem to be without foundation. Plain and simple. So in the end, the golden ratio isn't some magic number that secretly controls beauty. What's really interesting here is the story of the golden ratio. It tells us so much about our deep human need to find patterns, to connect ideas, and to believe that there's a simple, elegant order hidden underneath all the complexity of our world. And that kind of leaves us with a final thought, doesn't it? The golden ratio is this powerful example of how a really compelling story can feel more true than the actual facts. So the question to leave you with is this: what other universal truths that we all take for granted might actually be more myth than math?